Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to Geek-Stew. And today, guys, welcome back to Horror Stew. And today, specifically, welcome back to another episode of Ike's Hall of Horror. It's like the Hall of Fame, but it is my favorite, honestly, most watched horror series. I've done one of these previously, so if you've never watched it, go check it out. I typically don't talk about like mainstream horror films or horror franchises, not because that I don't like them, but generally because I want to try and use my platform. Obviously, I know that not a whole lot of people watch this, but I like to talk about lesser known horror films and series that hopefully can give people some new things to watch. That's typically why I do the underrated horror film series. And then on occasion, I'll do the overrated horror films that are just absolutely overrated films that I've seen and just generally speaking want to kind of bash on a little bit. But today, I do want to talk about a series that I've mentioned previously in other videos about similar films. But today, I do want to talk about a film series that honestly, in my opinion, has revolutionized the slasher film genre. I'm sure you can already guess what I'm talking about today, but today I'm going to be talking about the film series Scream. None other than Wes Craven's masterpiece, only second to that of Nightmare on Elm Street, Scream. Scream, it is an incredible series, and I love it so much, and I recently had a chance to go back there and watch the 4 movies that exist. I have seen the television series, but we're not going to talk about the television series today. The television series in of itself is a good concept. There's a lot of good stuff that is included in that series. Honestly, in my opinion, that's one of the best horror TV series out there, just because it does obviously work off the back of the Wes Craven's masterpiece. It works off the back of an already established horror movie series that, again, revolutionized the genre. So the TV show is great, but we're not really going to talk about it because, in my opinion, it's more of an homage than it is its own thing. Obviously, it has its own storylines and has 3 full seasons, if I remember correctly. The first 2 seasons are very closely correlated, and the third season is its own story. But I want to talk about the movies because the TV series, as well and as good as it did, not really going to talk about it. We're only going to talk about the original movies and what's to come. So let's get that done today, guys. Let's talk about one of my favorite horror series. Let's talk about Scream. So of course we cannot talk about Scream without starting at the beginning. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of give you some brief thoughts and opinions on each of the films, and then I'm ultimately going to give you my ranking of these films and some reasoning and rationale behind that ranking. And then at the very end, I'm going to give my final thoughts. So right now, I'm going to give you the titles. I'm going to tell you when they came out, and I'm going to give you some very brief information. Now, keep in mind, all of this is spoiler-filled goodness. If you've never seen these movies, which at this point, if you've not seen these and you call yourself a horror fan, I've got some questions for you. I just want to talk, but I want to talk with my fists. But let's do this today, guys. Let's talk about the Scream series. So, number 1. Scream, the original film, 1996. Yes, this is probably one of my all-time favorite movies. If you've never seen this movie, it is incredible. So this series is, this is the first one, and I gotta tell you, this has some amazing actors in it. Neve Campbell, Matthew Lillard. I can't remember the guy who plays Billy in it, but he's a pretty good-ish actor. He actually does very well in this role of a very psychotic, more demented entity. And honestly, I cannot say this enough, but I love Matthew Lillard. Matthew Lillard, in my opinion, is probably one of the best actors of our generation. If you've never seen Scooby-Doo, you're missing out. Maybe I'll talk about Scooby-Doo sometime because that's horror adjacent, I feel like. But anyhow, you also have David Arquette, Courtney Cox, Rose McGowan, Skeet Ulrich, which is the person that plays Billy, and Drew Barrymore. I don't know if I just said this, but Neve Campbell, who plays Sidney Prescott. Scream 1, again, 1996, the original, the OG. Long story short, it is a year after the death of Sidney Prescott's mother, Maureen Prescott. Sydney is, of course, still mourning the loss of her, her very loved mother, who she didn't know a whole lot about, but she did love her. They supposedly caught the murderer, which is Cotton Weary, who's in jail for about a year at this point, because they basically said that he had killed her. There was supposedly proof that pointed to this that they kind of allude to throughout the series. Basically, Cotton Weary was having an affair with his mother, her mother, I should say, but wasn't necessarily the murderer, as we come to find out. This film series, this is basically what started it all. It's the meta horror concept of, in 1996, we had a whole lot of horror movies, a whole lot of slasher films, everything from Halloween, Prom Night, My Bloody Valentine, what else? Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street. I mean, I could go on and on about the hundreds of slasher films that had come before this that honestly Scream uses as its plot. You see all these different slasher films, and you see these two, again, demented people, which is Matthew Lillard's character and Skeet Ulrich's character, Billy Loomis, and you see that they are very demented, and they are playing off of the fact that there were these horror movies, and that they're basically these they're fueled in a way by these tropes and all these different characterizations of these old horror films. And of course, it comes to find out that they had killed Sydney's mother because she was cheating on, again, her husband with Billy Loomis's father, which caused Billy's mother to leave. And then amongst other things, there's some other issues that come around, of course, but of course, Matthew Lillard and Billy Loomis, their characters, of course, are the ones that are orchestrating all these murders that are happening in the area. So a fun fact that I actually read about this was that Drew Barrymore was actually offered the position of Sidney Prescott, but declined to give it to another actress because she had already kind of made her name. That being said, it was then given to Neve Campbell, who in my opinion became super popular with this movie, as well as The Craft, but I feel like this was definitely, in my opinion, her biggest role of that era. That being said, now we have to kind of move into the next film, which in my opinion is still very good, but not as good as the original. But now we're going to talk about Scream 2. So Scream 2 is, of course, the sequel to the first Scream movie. The Scream 2 came out in 1997 as a continuation to the meta-horror genre. Scream 2, of course, continues to have the same actors as the first one, David Arquette, Neve Campbell, Courtney Cox, but also has some additional characters such as Sarah Michelle Gellar. I completely forgot to mention this person, but Jamie Kennedy was in the first film as well. Honestly, Jamie Kennedy's character in of itself is probably the best part of the Scream movies because he's so ingrained in the horror culture. He's basically creating the rules for these movies. To touch on this briefly, Jamie Kennedy's character in the first film basically tells the rules of the horror movie genre, right? Don't have sex, don't drink alcohol, don't do drugs, and never say I'll be back, because you won't be back. In the second film, he also does the same thing. Basically did what I would consider is a very meta move for the film series, of course. He basically said, these are the rules of a sequel. And then in later films, that evolution of that kind of continues to be made, and I'll kind of talk about that as well, how Jamie Kennedy's influence, while he does die in the second film, his influence does continue to spread into the third film and also the fourth film, and hopefully the fifth film. That being said, the general plot of this is that Sidney Prescott, as well as Jamie Kennedy's character, they actually go to college. That being said, when they go to college, they basically thought that they left everything behind. It's been about a year since the tragedy that had happened to them in their high school years. And they're finally trying to heal. But as it may happen, there starts to be deaths again. The events of the what's called the Woodsbury Massacre has been made into a movie and a book by Gail Weathers, which is Courtney Cox's character. So in this film, there begins to have additional murders that happen throughout the entity in which that is existing there. And so they continue to see these murders, and they start seeing patterns with the murders, thinking that, well, this might be a copycat. Oh, but this is no copycat. This is much more than a copycat. And what I mean by that is this. In this film, we find out that Billy Loomis's mother is very much alive and is very much angry that Billy Loomis died. Even though Billy Loomis was a psychotic killer, he apparently took after his mother, who also is a psychotic killer. She is being teamed up with another character in the film series, who actually I recognize from the Santa Clarita Diet. He plays the father in that movie, in that TV show. But he is in this as well, and his name is Mickey, I believe. Don't quote me on that. But he, of course, is in addition to Billy Loomis's mother, the other murderer. So again, 2 murderers. But this time, he is just a straight serial killer, okay? He's already demented as it is. Billy Loomis's mother is just basically manipulating him to basically do her agenda. The point of this is going to be that, at least the end goal for Billy Loomis's mother, is that he's going to take the fall for all of this. He's going to take the fall for this, and he's basically going to go to trial and say, oh, the movies made me do it. Of course, that doesn't end up happening because Billy Loomis's mother does not want there to be any survivors. So she kills Mickey and then attempts to kill Gail Leathers and, of course, Cindy Prescott, because she's the one that she's after ultimately. But she'll kill anybody who's in the way. So there's this whole connection to the original film that makes it a very good movie, but honestly, the thing that really, in my opinion, made it so good was that they talk a lot about sequels, right? They always talk about how sequels kill the horror movie genre. There's literally a scene where Jamie Kennedy's character's in a film class talking about sequels, and there's no such thing as a good horror movie sequel, and that horror movie sequels typically kill the series and everything else. And in my opinion, that takes it a step above being meta, in my opinion, because you're talking about yourself not just being a horror movie, not just being a slasher flick. You're also addressing the concerns that a lot of people have with horror movies that are sequels. Because a lot of folks, when you make these horror movie sequels, they're not as good. The only horror movie series that I can even tell you that has a better sequel than the original, in my opinion, would be Friday the 13th. But Friday the 13th was originally a ripoff of Halloween. So the original film, honestly, you could take that out completely and just play the second film and go from there. So in my opinion, Friday the 13th is pretty much basically it's the one that makes the rule, right? The rule that makes the exception, or the exception that makes the rule. So in that being said, Scream 2 is just an incredibly good sequel to the original movie. It basically, in my opinion, almost holds up to the exact same tenor of the first film, but it does fall short in a couple of ways. It doesn't fall so short that I don't enjoy the movie, but it does fall short in a handful of ways. The kills begin to be a little more graphic, and again, try to amp up the violence of that of the first film, as do all horror movie series and trilogies and quadrilogies and everything else. But Scream 2, fantastic film. If you've never watched it, watch it. And now we enter a new millennium. We enter 2000 with a Scream 3 film, a cap to a trilogy, if you will. Scream 3, of course, is following our titular characters, that being David Arquette, Neve Campbell, Courtney Cox Arquette at this time. They're married. We also have some familiar faces. Jamie Kennedy does make a cameo. Of course, there are other entities within this, but one actually that I want to mention is Patrick Dempsey, a young, very handsome Patrick Dempsey I do want to mention. But basically the plot of this, long story short, Cindy Prescott has gone off the grid. She's had enough of this bullshit. She's living in the middle of nowhere, and she goes under a different name, works for a domestic violence hotline for women, which is great. Honestly, a very interesting character development for Sydney, basically trying to help other people as much as she can while protecting herself. And the whole purpose of this movie is that all of a sudden in Hollywood, people start dying on the set of the new Stab movie. The Stab movies, as I mentioned previously about Scream 2, are films made after that of the events of the other Scream movies. So the first Scream movie was made into a movie within the movie series called Stab. And Scream 2 was also made into a movie within the movie series called Stab 2. Now, this is a few years later, so they're actually working on Stab 3, I believe. Yes, it is Stab 3. Just confirmed it on the Wikipedia article. But Stab 3 is being worked on, and people start dropping like fucking flies. So everybody's on top of this. Dewey, which is David Arquette's character, is actually already on site because he is there for the purpose to help train the actor who is playing him in the films. Is also there to help the Gail Weathers actor. I can't remember which actress that is. But basically, he's there to kind of help as a primary source for the events of the original movies. People start dying, so everybody comes together. Courtney, Neve Campbell's character, Sydney's trying to stay out of the action as much as possible, but she eventually gets drawn into it when the killer figures out who she is, where she is. He calls into the domestic violence hotline and basically scares Sydney into coming to Hollywood to essentially try and help the other characters figure out what's going on. And after a period of time, we eventually find out that the killer is in fact her long-lost brother. Her mother, Maureen Prescott, was originally an actress in Hollywood before she had Sydney, and had a son. The son, of course, was born out of a very bad situation and given up for adoption. And honestly, it's a very realistic, in my opinion, backstory to a horror serial killer. Because when he tried to find his mother and try and figure out his past, his mother turned him away. And of course, Maureen Prescott wanted to turn him away because that was her old life. Her old life as an actress and her old life as a person who was being walked over was over. Now, of course, Maureen then would go on to cheat on her husband, and then the son, which in this case is the movie director of the Stab 3 movie, being Roman. Now he actually plotted with Billy Loomis and Matthew Lillard's character in the first movie to have Maureen killed. So now basically we have this entire, not necessarily a series retcon, but we have this addition that we didn't know about in the first film because the characters, the bad guys died before we could really tell. Although I will say I actually read a theory the other day that we never actually saw Matthew Lillard's character die in the movie. We just saw him get crushed by a TV. He could, in theory, still be alive, so that's something cool maybe if they want to throw him in the remake, or not remake, but the next movie. But however, to kind of get back on track here, the long and short of it is that Roman is now trying to take his life that he deserved back from Sydney and trying to make her out to be the bad guy, trying to make her out to be the evil person. And in my opinion, this is a very interesting plot maneuver to try and justify the serial killer, because not only are we doing that, but also in the film, we're also working off of trilogy rules, right? Jamie Kennedy's character comes back for a cameo on a videotape that he made prehumously that was shown after his death in the series. The video was shown by his sister, who basically talked about, hey, these are the rules of a trilogy, because if this shit starts happening again, all bets are off. He talks about how anybody can die, because Cotton Weary dies in this movie. He's like the first person that dies in the beginning of Scream 3, so anybody can die. The main character can die. David Arquette, Courtney Cox, we can all die. That's the point of a trilogy, is that they're going to amp up the violence. The kills are going to be more gruesome, and nobody's safe. That's the rules. Them's the rules, boys. And so that's the point of the third film, is that nobody's safe, nothing is sacred, anybody can die. And they established that from the get-go, and they continue to reinforce that by the fact that we essentially watch multiple people die, or at least we think we watch multiple people die, and we're pretty sure that we're going to watch Sydney die as well. That being said, at the end of the day, this film ends on a somewhat good note. We show that Sydney, of course, survives and then goes on to reinvent her life, as we see in the next film. But Scream 3 is very much a good movie. I honestly really liked Scream 3. Scream 3 had a very different respect for the series. It continued to be meta, but it also continued to stay truthful and faithful to the overall series. But I don't want to continue going on that for too long, because we do need to talk about the last movie, that being Scream 4. Last and not best, and certainly not least, we have Scream 4 from 2011. This was this one started out on a low note. If you've ever watched this movie, you kind of think, oh, well, they're just going to continue to recycle the same old bullshit. So you kind of start off thinking it's going to be bad, but then they kind of flip it on you in the beginnings and the openings. Very, very interesting and very meta. More meta than being meta. I don't know. There's a lot of meta bullshit. Anyhow, we come back to the town of Woodsboro, and we're now following the titular character of Jill. Jill is actually Sydney's cousin, I think, because Jill's mother was Maureen's sister. Therefore, that would be Sydney's aunt, ergo Jill being her cousin. Yeah, that works out in my head. So we have Jill as the titular character, who is played by none other than Emma Roberts. We also have her friend Kirby, which is Hayden Panettiere. And we also have a Rory Culkin, who is the, of course, Macaulay Culkin's brother. So we have a lot of very great actors in this, as well as Adam Brody, Alison Brie, Anthony Henderson, Courtney Cox, David Arquette, and Neve Campbell, who all return to reprise their roles. And definitely this film is incredibly interesting and incredibly venturous, and it does test the limits of modern horror. Scream 4 definitely pushes the limits of the original Scream franchise and the new era. This one definitely tests, in my opinion, the merit of the original Scream series, because you have to think that the original Scream series was very interesting, very inventive, and very meta for the time in which it was released. Because we're talking about literally the 90s and the year 2000 were when these films were released originally. So you have about an 11-year gap since the last film. And this film does a very good job of staying on topic and staying on track, but doing so without making everything repetitive. There are some returning values and characteristics within this film, but it's not entirely the same. So it's still a little bit different in order to keep you basically keep your attention. Because without that, I would definitely say if this didn't try to be new and this didn't try to invent on top of the original concept, this would be a completely boring movie where we basically see them regurgitating 3 movies worth of concepts and information, which they didn't do. This actually did a very interesting thing where they basically approached it from a completely different perspective. They brought it into the new age, talking about the killers. This isn't a remake. This is a what is it? A screamake? It's a screamake is what they called in the film, because in the film, rather than having Jamie Kennedy's character, they do create another movie club at the high school in Woodsboro. I'm sorry. And then the film club actually talks about how the murders that are happening follow the rules more of that of a screamake. Basically, they're reinventing the old formula, and they're going to do some different things, such as film all of the murders and put it on the internet. You heard that right. That's basically what they're doing. So they start killing people, and eventually it boils down to a final party, right? They do the same thing they do in all the other movies. There's a final event, a final impact point where everybody's going to get together and everybody's going to start dying. And that's exactly what happens. We eventually find out that, of course, the murderers in this case are Jill, which is Emma Roberts' character, and then, of course, the other is Rory Culkin's character, who is one of the members of the film club, who helped to create the rules of a screamake, in his opinion. So these two are the 2 killers. Of course, there is, this kind of follows the same plot as all the other films, that there's most likely at least 2, if not 1. Obviously, the only film to have only 1 killer was Scream 3. But I've actually heard some theories that there may have been another killer, but that's a whole nother thing altogether. Anyhow, Scream 4 follows a similar formula, 2 killers, and of course, the murders are completely new, all invented, definitely a different story. But we find out that Jill's one of the killers. She kills Rory Culkin's character, and then she has to inflict damage on herself, which was a very interesting thing that they did, because she wanted to be made to be the survivor. They wanted to pretend that she was the innocent victim that was being attacked by Rory Culkin's character and by her previous ex-boyfriend within the film. So they tried to fabricate this whole thing, and she has to kill Sydney, and then she has to inflict wounds upon herself. She held a knife and ran into a wall to create a stab wound in her shoulder. She threw herself into a mirror or a picture, piece of glass, and then, of course, threw herself through a glass coffee table in an attempt to make her wounds seem very realistic and very obvious. And so, honestly, it just all makes sense, because they're basically making it meta on top of meta. And they create this very sinister story within the story about how Jill doesn't want to just be this normal person. Her cousin is Sidney Prescott. Sidney Prescott's a famous victim who has a bunch of movies in her name, who has books made about her, who wrote her own book about stopping being a victim. And so Jill wants the same thing. She wants her 10 minutes of fame so she doesn't have to do anything for the rest of her life. And so this film definitely reinvented the concept of the meta horror film by introducing new factors and new information that honestly made the film even better. But that's enough about Scream 4. I'm making this too long, but we need to move on into final thoughts as well as my official ranking of the Scream series. Alright, sorry if the image here changed or the positioning changed. I actually had to do something real quick. Something came up, so I had to take care of that. But I am back with a slightly different camera angle, so don't worry. But long story short, some final thoughts on my official ranking here. And obviously, keep in mind that there is another Scream movie coming out in 2022. This is, of course, going to be an additional episode on the trilogy, or not, it's technically a quadrilogy right now, but we're adding in an additional episode there. So, that should be interesting, that should be fun, that should be amazing. I'm very excited for that. Not a whole lot of details have come out about it, but they have brought out some casting for it. So if you are interested in that, I would go check that out if I were you. So now we get to talk about who and what episode is the best and what is my ranking. So out of the 4 movies, here is my ranking. I have to give number 1 to the original Scream movie, that is right. The original Scream movie is, of course, going to be the best of the best because this is the original. This is the granddaddy of all meta horror films. Like, this is how it began. So the number 1 goes to Scream 1, of course. Number 2, and this may be controversial, goes to Scream 4. Scream 4 had to reinvent the genre in order for it to work. It had to reinvent the meta horror film slasher flick genre in order for it to work, and it did so in such a good way that Scream 4 became I would say probably the next best movie in the series. This is not to say that the other films are bad by any means, but in my opinion, Scream 4 brought a whole new breath of life to the genre and to the series that, in my opinion, just makes it such a good film. So you have 1, you have 4, and then you have 3. Now you're probably saying, why is 3 your next favorite? Why isn't 2 your next favorite? And my only response to that would be this. Scream 2 had a somewhat predictable, I would say to an extent, storyline. If I had to give you a guess on who was going to be the next villain in a Scream franchise, I would tell you that they would be somehow connected to the original series, the original movie. And while Scream 3 did this with Sidney Prescott's long-lost brother, whose mother had a baby in Hollywood, whatever, while Scream 3 did this, I did not expect the ending of Scream 3. Couldn't expect it, couldn't see it coming, not in 1,000 years. Because it's so predictable in some situations, because obviously the long-lost evil brother is a very common trope in a lot of horror films and horror media, but in my opinion, this one just did it in such a special way, and in such a way that honestly makes the series seem even more volatile, right? That there was a third man in the original movie that plotted the death of Maureen Prescott, and that just changed the game. And then finally, but definitely not least, this definitely Scream 2. Now, there was a couple reasons why I didn't like Scream 2. I felt like killing Jamie Kennedy's character was unnecessary. In fact, I feel like having Jamie Kennedy's character continue to survive would have provided a better storyline. I feel like killing other characters is fine. I even feel like killing main characters, even like Cotton Weary or other entities, could have worked. But in my opinion, it's sort of, I feel, backwards to remove such an important element from the movies. Jamie Kennedy's character, in my opinion, was sort of a piece of the glue that held the rest of the cast together. Being able to come up with these sort of predictable circumstances that these films will follow, but doing so in a very inventive and intelligent way. So Jamie Kennedy's character dying in the second film, maybe not really care for it because that prevented him from being in future films. So there are other things about Scream 2 that I felt like were not as good. I felt like the Mickey character, as much as I love the actor, was not a very good choice as a killer. I feel like there could have been somebody else who maybe was a little bit closer to the chest. I feel like adding in somebody who is maybe from the original cast, maybe Cotton Weary. Cotton Weary would have been a definite better choice in my opinion. But of course, I feel like they couldn't have done Cotton Weary because Cotton Weary was an important death in 3. So to some extent, I do like 2, and in some ways, it's equal to 3. But at the very least, I like 3 because the final storyline, the final finale, the final fight was just so climactic. And it just brought a whole new story to this whole common trope of the super villain being superhuman, right? The villain's going to be superhuman. He's not, you can't put him down with guns. You're just going to have to blow him up, is what Jamie Kennedy said. And ultimately, they didn't have to blow him up, but they definitely had to reinvent their preconceived notions about how to take somebody out with a chest shot. So take it for what you will. That is just my personal opinion on the rankings of the Scream franchise. Of course, this is just me, one person, spitting words onto the screen. So if you agree with that, let me know, or let me know your definitive listings, any comments down below. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode of Hall of Horror. I really wanted to talk about a series that I recently went back and watched, and Oh boy, I love the Scream movies. I'm super excited for the 2022 version. It's been about 10 years since the last one, and I don't know, there's just something so sweet about revisiting a series like that, and then, doing it preemptively for a movie that's going to be coming out in about a year. I don't really remember. I think it's beginning of next year, but I'm super excited for it. I'm very interested in what's going to happen. I do not have any clue what the storyline is going to be about, but I actually came up with a couple things that I think would be cool to talk about. I feel like, maybe hinting at Matthew Lillard's character still being alive. Obviously, we didn't see an official death for him. We saw him get crushed by a TV, but for all intents and purposes, as far as horror movie villains go, they could potentially survive something like that, whereas opposed to Billy Loomis, who got shot in the head. That's kind of more of a very definitive ending to him. That being said, I also feel like they can introduce some other people. Hayden Panettiere's character from Scream 4, Kirby, I'm pretty sure they're listed as part of the cast because they didn't technically die in Scream 4, so bringing them back as a character who lived through the events of Scream 4 would be very interesting. You, of course, have Courtney Cox, David Arquette, and Neve Campbell, who have all come back for the film, as well as the character, I cannot remember the actress's name, from Scream 3 that plays Jamie Kennedy's sister in the movie. She will be brought back as well. I cannot remember her name. Maybe I should know her name, but who knows. Point being is that she's going to be in it, so we may be able to see some other respectives or attributes to that of Jamie Kennedy's character and his lineage, if you will. But ultimately, this film is going to be very interesting. It's going to be very interesting to see how they're going to basically make this movie as meta as possible. You don't have we honestly don't have a whole lot of 21st century, we really don't have a whole lot of 2010 slasher flicks for them to really parody in a way that really made it into the popular genre. A lot of the big popular horror movies of this era were more supernatural or something to that respect. So I suppose we shall see what happens, but until then, all we have to go on is that we have a movie coming out. Fingers crossed that it is excellent, but we won't know until it happens. So maybe I'll do another retrospective when that comes up next year. But until then, I'm super pumped. And for final thoughts, watch the Scream movies if you've not watched them. Just fucking do it. You can get on HBO Max and watch the first three. I don't know, the fourth one's not on there, but the fourth one you could probably find elsewhere. But you will not regret it because the Scream movies are amazing and I 100% recommend them. They're one of my favorite horror film series of all time. So let's go ahead and close this up by saying I hope everybody out there staying safe, staying healthy, and staying awesome. Follow us on social media if you don't already. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and I'm gonna take a deep breath, calm myself down. But enjoy your week. I hope obviously this is coming out on Friday, so I hope your week was good. I hope your weekend is better, and I hope the rest of your next week is even greater. So keep doing great things. We will see you in the next one. See ya.